The clock on the wall measured the silence in the office with a rhythmic, metallic snap. Mark sat motionless, his eyes locked onto the brokerage app. His fingers hovered over the glass, trembling slightly as he scrolled through 20 different ticker symbols. Every one of them was a promise he had made to himself 3 years ago. He had followed the rules. He had spread his savings thin, balancing ETFs against tech stocks and gold, meticulously building a portfolio that was supposed to be his safety net. Now, the screen felt like a cage. He tapped the performance tab, watching the numbers load with agonizing slowness. $120. That was the total return for 3 years of discipline. He looked away from the screen, his gaze drifting to the desk's surface, where the light caught the edges of his unpaid electric bill. The reality of his situation hit him with the weight of a physical blow. He had spent more on the coffee he drank while researching these stocks than the market had ever returned to him. He was playing a game of defense. He toggled back to the main dashboard, hoping the numbers would shift, but they remained fixed in their mediocrity. $120. He looked down at the desk again. The electric bill sat there, a bright white rectangle against the dark wood, demanding payment he could not afford to ignore. He picked up the bill, the paper crisp and sharp against his thumb. It was for $200. He had earned less in a year of professional investing than he owed for a single month of basic utilities. A bitter laugh escaped him, short and dry. He reached for his coffee mug, finding it empty, and remembered the receipt he had crumpled into the bin earlier that morning. $4 a cup, twice a day, every day for months. He had spent nearly twice that annual return just on the caffeine required to stay awake. The math was not just bad. It was insulting. He leaned forward, the chair creaking under his weight, and traced the line of the bill with his index finger. The diversification he had prized was nothing more than a slow-motion collapse, a strategy designed to keep him exactly where he was broke, tired, and tethered. He pulled up the calculator on his phone. He did the math, slowly, tapping each digit into the screen. 3 years of daily research, 4 hours every evening, plus the cost of premium subscriptions and the endless cups of coffee to keep his eyes open. The total cost of his effort was staggering. He looked back at the brokerage app, at the $120 he had earned over 365 days. He was paying for the privilege of losing his own time. The realization hit him like a physical weight in his chest. He was not an investor. He was a consumer of his own failure. He looked at the ticker symbols one last time, the tech stocks, the ETFs, the gold, and saw them for what they were. Digital noise designed to keep him distracted. He did not need to diversify his losses. He needed to stop the bleeding. His thumb hovered over the screen, steady now. He did not hesitate. He pressed the close button with a sharp, decisive click. The screen went black, instantly reflecting his own face in the dark glass. The office felt quieter, the hum of the computer fan suddenly audible. Mark stood up, the chair rolling back and hitting the wall with a dull thud. He did not look back at the phone. He turned toward the bookshelf, his eyes scanning the spines of forgotten volumes. Most were covered in a thin gray layer of dust. He pushed past folders of old tax returns and outdated financial magazines, his fingers trailing over the rough edges of paper. He reached the bottom shelf, where the heavier, technical texts were buried. He pulled out a manual on data analysis, the cover stiff and cold. He blew the dust off the top, a small cloud rising into the air, and felt the weight of the book in his hands. It was dense, solid, and real. He walked back to the desk, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He did not set the book down gently. He slammed it onto the wood, the sound echoing like a gavel. The impact vibrated through the desk, rattling his empty coffee mug. He was done playing defense. He opened the book to the first page, the paper crisp and sharp, and began to read. Mark pulled his notepad into the center of the desk, right next to the open manual. The page was a chaotic map of his past 3 years, 20 different ticker symbols, each scribbled in frantic, hopeful ink. He looked at the list. It was a graveyard of small gains and wasted potential. He picked up his pen, the metal cold against his palm. He started at the top. He drew a single, thick line through the first symbol, then the second, then the third. The scratch of the pen against the paper was loud in the quiet room. He hesitated for a second on a tech stock he had held since the beginning, his grip tightening, but he forced the ink through it anyway. He kept moving, his hand blurring as he slashed through every entry on the page. He did not stop until the paper was a mess of black ink and jagged lines. He reached the bottom of the list. Only one entry remained, a business idea he had kept hidden in the margins for months. He stared at it. The clutter was gone. The noise of the market had vanished. For the first time in 3 years, the path forward was not a complex web of percentages, but a single, focused line. He dropped the pen, his chest loosening, and leaned back. The clarity was sharp, cold, and absolute. Mark did not hesitate. He opened his brokerage app one last time, the interface now looking like a relic of a failed experiment. He navigated to the withdrawal screen, his thumb hovering over the button. He entered the full amount, $4,800. The screen flashed a warning about potential missed gains, but he tapped confirm without reading the prompt. He watched the progress bar crawl across the display, the digital representation of his savings slowly draining to zero. When the confirmation receipt appeared, he closed the app and deleted the icon from his home screen. The silence in the room felt different now. He turned to his laptop and pulled up the enrollment page for the professional certification course. He entered his payment details, his fingers steady as he clicked submit. The screen refreshed, displaying a welcome message. He printed the receipt, the paper warm from the printer, and placed it on his desk right over the crossed-out notepad. He was no longer a spectator of the market. He had purchased his entry into the game. He closed the laptop, stood up, and walked toward the door. The lobby of the hotel was a wall of sound. Mark stood just outside the double doors, his hand resting on the brass handle. Inside, dozens of voices overlapped, creating a steady, rhythmic hum of professional ambition. He adjusted his grip on the leather portfolio tucked under his arm. His pulse hammered against his ribs, a sharp reminder that he was no longer hiding behind a screen. He took a breath, the air smelling of expensive coffee and floor wax. A man in a sharp gray suit brushed past him, laughing into a phone, and Mark felt the sudden, crushing weight of being an outsider. He pulled a single sheet of paper from his portfolio, the summary of his data-driven solution. He read the first line, then the second. The numbers were solid. The logic was sound. He was not here to gamble on someone else's growth. He was here to sell his own. He pushed the doors open. The light from the ballroom hit him, bright and unforgiving. He stepped across the threshold, his boots clicking on the polished marble. The wall of sound surged to meet him. He did not look for an exit. He scanned the room, his eyes locking onto the center of the crowd, and began to move forward. Mark navigated the room, his eyes scanning for someone not already engaged in a conversation. He spotted a man near the refreshment table, checking his watch with a look of practiced impatience. Mark moved toward him, his stride measured. He stopped 3 feet away, waiting for a gap in the man's attention. The man turned, his gaze sliding past Mark as if he were part of the furniture. Mark did not retreat. He stepped into the man's line of sight and spoke, his voice steady and stripped of filler. He did not ask for time. He presented a problem and the specific data-driven solution he had built to solve it. The man started to look away, his mouth opening to offer a polite dismissal. Mark leaned in slightly, emphasizing the core metric. The man froze. The dismissive expression vanished, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. The ambient noise seemed to recede. The client stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the paper in Mark's hand. He did not nod. He did not offer a polite smile. He looked at the numbers, then back at Mark, his silence stretching into the crowded room. Mark held his ground, his fingers steady against the edge of the page. He did not apologize for the directness of his pitch. He waited. The client reached out, his fingers brushing the paper, and pulled it closer to examine the core metric one last time. He looked up, his eyes sharp, searching for a flicker of doubt in Mark's expression. Mark met the gaze without blinking. The client exhaled, a short, decisive sound, and reached into his inner pocket. He pulled out a heavy, cream-colored business card. He held it out, his grip firm. Mark took it. The card was thick, embossed, and cool to the touch. It was not just paper. It was an invitation to enter the game he had spent years watching from the sidelines. The client turned, signaling the end of the conversation. Mark looked down at the card, then back at the room. He tucked the card into his pocket, his hand closing over it, and turned toward the exit. The office was quiet. The same room where he had once stared at a screen of 20 ticker symbols. Mark sat at his desk, his laptop open. He did not look at the brokerage app. He did not check the ETFs or the gold prices. He navigated to his bank statement, his cursor hovering over the refresh button. He paused. For 3 years, he had been conditioned to expect a rounding error, a meager gain that barely covered a cup of coffee. He took a breath, his finger clicking the mouse with a sharp, deliberate sound. The screen flickered, loading the final data for the year. He did not look for a percentage. He looked for the bottom line. The number appeared, bold and clear, $20,000. It was not a dividend from a diversified fund. It was not a lucky trade. It was the direct result of the project he had built, the value he had provided to his clients. He leaned back, his chair creaking in the silence. The clutter of his old financial life was gone. He looked at the screen again, the digits steady and real. He had spent years playing defense, spreading his bets thin across a market he did not control. Now, he saw the truth in the numbers. He had become the engine of his own growth. Mark looked at the bank statement one last time before closing the tab. The screen reflected his own face, steady and focused. He reached for the notebook he had kept for 3 years, the one filled with ticker symbols and diversification percentages. He flipped through the pages, seeing the thin, cautious notes he had scribbled in the margins. He did not need them anymore. He tore the pages out, one by one, and dropped them into the wastebasket. The sound of the paper hitting the bottom was final. He realized then that wealth was not a pie chart of safety. It was not a collection of small, disconnected bets meant to hedge against failure. It was the harvest of the specific, high-level work he was now performing. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had once hovered over a brokerage app. Now, those hands were capable of building solutions that generated real value. The illusion of the safe, diversified path had evaporated. He pushed the notebook aside, cleared the space on his desk, and felt the weight of the old defensive strategy lift. Mark sat in the silence of his office, the air feeling different than it had a year ago. He reached for his phone, the device that had once been his primary tool for checking market fluctuations. A notification pinged an alert about a diversified index fund dropping by a fraction of a percent. He looked at the screen, then swiped the notification away. He did not care. He turned the phone face down. For years, the voices had been constant. They spoke in terms of risk management, asset allocation, and the necessity of playing it safe. They were the voices of people who feared the ground beneath them. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. He realized those voices were not his own. They were echoes of a system designed to keep him small. He took a deep breath, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He walked back to his desk and picked up his tablet, deleting the brokerage apps one by one. Each tap was a release. He was done with the hedging. He was done with the safety nets that only served to trap him in mediocrity. Mark pulled his chair closer to the desk. The wood was cool under his palms. He adjusted the lamp, angling the light so it fell directly onto the center of his workspace, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. He reached for his laptop and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, casting a stark white glow across his face. He did not check a single ticker. He did not look at a single portfolio balance. He opened the project file that contained the data-driven solution he had spent months refining. His fingers moved to the keyboard, hovering for a heartbeat before he began to type. The first line of code appeared, then the second. He was no longer reacting to the market. He was shaping the output that the market would eventually value. He leaned into the desk, his posture rigid and intent. Every movement was precise. He was building the foundation of his own enterprise. The screen light reflected in his eyes, steady and unwavering. Mark watched the data points align, not as symbols of a volatile market, but as clear indicators of the value he had created. He stopped typing and rested his hands on the desk. He looked at his palms, then at the project on his monitor. 3 years ago, he had been a man looking for safety in a sea of numbers, hoping for a return he could not control. Now, the results were tangible. He had stopped trying to be a fund manager with a pauper's account. He had stopped listening to the voices that preached caution while keeping him stagnant. The cycle was broken. It had not been dismantled by diversification or clever hedging. It was shattered by the singular, high-conviction decision to stop betting on external systems and start betting on himself. He realized that wealth was never a pie chart of safety. It was the direct output of the value he provided to the world. He leaned back, the chair creaking in the quiet room. The fear of losing his savings had been replaced by the confidence of knowing how to generate more. He took a final look at the screen, closed the laptop, and stood up. The path forward was clear. He was no longer a spectator in his own life. He was the architect. The only bet that ever mattered was the one he placed on his own potential, and he had won.